here, right?
We're live.
Welcome back to the Vermont House Appropriations Committee. It is Wednesday still, February 22nd, 2023. It's a little bit after 3 o'clock and we have the honor of hosting today right now and to the end of our day here, the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board and their budget to hear all about the wonderful work that they are doing in Vermont. So I think you've been here before. You know everybody?
We have met at least.
We have met just, okay.
And some of you more than that. I bet you he can recite our bios back to us at this point.
All right, great. So I appreciate your patience and waiting for us to get settled in. And so, please.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair, for having us. For the record, I'm Gus Seelig. I'm the Director for the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. With me is our Policy Director, Polly Major, our Director of Conservation and Rural Community Development. Trey Martin is over there, and many of you know him. And the heavy lifter on our staff over these last pandemic years, Jenny Hislop, is our Housing Director. And I see in the audience is one of our board members, Maura Collins from VHFA, and Chris Donnelly, who's with the Champlain Housing Trust that we've done a huge amount of work with through the pandemic. I'd like to do a few things because several of you are new to the committee and we have not, other than meeting on the Budget Adjustment Act, really had the chance to talk about the broad array of our programs. We're not one program, but a constellation of both housing and conservation and historic preservation programs. And so at the very least, to the extent we can be a resource for your constituents, we want to tell you what we do and how they can reach out and get help from us. We want to report on what we've done over the last couple of years. You've gotten 2 reports from the board electronically. One is our annual report and one is from the Farm and Forest Viability Program. And if any of you prefer hard copies, though that we're told not to send them, I will get you hard copies. We don't print very many, but I'm happy to get them. And of course, we provide a bunch of financial information.
Gus, I missed introducing somebody here from the other committee.
Okay.
You want to introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. I'm Ashley Bartley. I'm in the General and Housing Committee.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Okay. And just those reports electronically may not quite look exactly like this, but these are what they are if you want to find them.
Did we get them in the mail? Did they go out in the mail?
They've come electronically to you.
Okay, electronically.
And I'm happy, you guys get so much email. If anybody needs any information, I'm happy to provide it. I'm happy to talk about community need. We really work at the crossroads of land use in all directions, meaning where do we build? Where do we need natural areas? Where do we want food to come from? And we're very focused on, I think, the 2 big crises of this time. One is the housing crisis that is not just a Vermont problem, but really become a national problem. As I talk to advocates and practitioners around the country, everybody is short of housing just about everywhere in the United States today for a variety of reasons, and certainly all through northern New England, big problem. And we're we're all dealing with the climate crisis, and that crosses our housing and conservation work. I'm happy also to talk about the governor's recommend, as well as the value of one-time funding over many different years, going back to when Sally Fox was the chair of this committee. We've been viewed as a source for one-time funding when there have been surpluses, because when you buy or build an asset, it's there and it's there for the public. Presentation you're going to see here is probably too long. I'm happy for you to interrupt me as I go along. In fact, I'd probably be disappointed. And knowing that we're at the end of your day, if anybody, I know you've just had a break, but if your back is like mine and you need to get up, I will not take any offense. Anybody needs to stretch in the middle of this. The photograph that you're looking at in this first slide, I think is emblematic of the kind of transformational impact we try to have with the investment we make on your behalf. And you're looking at South Hero, Vermont, and there's a local group called CIDR that looked for a site for more than 10 years, all over the islands. And of course, it's one of those places without a lot of infrastructure. And this fall, they opened 30 affordable apartments, and the building next to it is actually the fire station. And though you can't see it pictured here, across the way is a library and a health center. And what that's really done has been to anchor a village of South Hero that was not really so present before. And that's the sort of growth pattern that we like to see and that we like to support on a regular basis. And just by the way, you do see the lake out there, and so some of the residents do have a view of Lake Champlain from their apartments.
Fire station, library, and
Health center.
health center.
Yeah. And so I think one of the things I say to our staff is when we're looking at a project, can you imagine somebody you love living there and being happy? And that's generally what our goal is. This is the mission statement that was written in 1987 in 10 VSA Chapter 15. And it asks us not just to do housing or conservation or historic preservation, but to engage in it because it's of primary importance to both economic vitality and quality of life. And you're looking at Lake Memphremagog and the city of Newport. And these next few slides will just talk about, this next slide, how our impact has had an impact on the community up there over time or in coming years. And on the right are two brothers, the Chappett brothers, who when I first met Red Chappett, he was at the beginning of his ag career, and like me, we both had heads of hair back 30 years ago. And we've done business with him on 5 occasions. He's used the sale of development rights on land as a way to build up what is now a large farm operation. When we were coming out of the recession of the early 90s, he was building a freestall barn, and that year it was the largest construction project that took place in Orleans County. And so he's used the purchase of development rights to become more efficient and to scale up to a place that can be profitable. On the left is a site that folks from Newport know well. It is the old Sacred Heart campus. And we have just funded 26 units attached to the convent there, but with plans for another 3 or 4 phases down the road. And so 26 apartments will get built in the next year, along with another group of apartments over in Newport Center in the town. But there's also, the community very much wants home ownership, so we're expecting condominiums to be built in the school building, and it's an 8-acre site that should lend itself to more housing as well as recreation. And in the middle, you kind of see the land use pattern that I think goes back to something called the Vermont Countryside Commission of the 1930s. You can see Newport to the left, you see the lake, and you see open space on either side. And we've had a land use policy, and this goes to the board's creation of compact settlement surrounded by a working landscape, which is pretty well written into our mission statement. So that's one piece of our mission. This part of the statute instructs the board about what to consider in funding projects. And it asks us, among other things, to maintain balance between our primary goals, to leverage the money you put up with as much other money as possible, to pursue permanent affordability, to consider geography, and my favorite part of the statute, number 2, the need for a timely response to unpredictable circumstances or special opportunities. And that's my favorite because it is a reminder to my staff, to our partners, to the board, that one of the expectations is that we're nimble and flexible, and whether we're responding to a fire in a downtown, flooding event, or a COVID crisis, we try to be nimble and try to move things ahead. In the annual report, we're asked to report on what our activities were in a given year or 18-month period. The biggest change that you'll see if you were looking at our report from 4 years ago is the number of homes and apartments that we're doing in that time period. And it used to be in the 300 to 400 range. And there you see we've about tripled that activity. Also describe the kind of impacts we have, and more I frame our work as rural community development. And I just want to, I know that there's a concern about access for rural communities, and I'll talk in a few minutes about how we try to make sure every part of the state has access to our resources one way or another. But another former chair of this committee, Representative Heath, is from the town of Westford, not a very big community, and that is a celebration in that community when they acquired a town forest adjacent to the elementary school that has functioned in COVID as an outdoor classroom. And if you know that community, that's a huge turnout of people. Same thing happened in a number of other communities with town forests. This is our 35th anniversary, so this is the big numbers. And I want to say a word about how we do our work. Some people think we're housing developers, and we are not. We're conservationists who are on the ground with landowners. We're not that. We're a funding entity. We're kind of like a public foundation. People bring us applications. They compete for our funding. Municipalities and nonprofits are our primary partners. And so what we've done very simply is take $400 million over 35 years that you've given us from the taxpayers of Vermont and ask them to leverage it. They've gone out and raised another over $2 billion to achieve all the results you see here. That includes 15,000 homes and apartments and a huge impact on our agricultural industries. But we're also focused on things like how do we help with the demographic challenges, and that's why we've sponsored 600 AmeriCorps members across those years. To speak about conservation for a moment, recreation is absolutely part of the farm economy, part of the rural economy. There was a study a few years back about the impact of Kingdom Trails in the Northeast Kingdom, and back then it was thought to be more than $12 million annually. And as somebody said to me, when people arrive in your community just on a bicycle, the only other thing they might be carrying with them is a piece of plastic with which they need to buy their goods and services from the community. So it's been a great economic driver for that part of the state. Down below is an old church that the people of Putney have repurposed as a great performing arts facility. We invest in community gathering places that will have a way to bring a community together and sometimes create economic activity. And Next Stage Arts has been one of those places. The Lamoille Grange is the Center for the Arts in Morrisville. The picture on the left is the farm in Sharon where we got a huge bargain sale from the owner to protect the stand of maple, and that meant we drew down more than $500,000 of federal funds without spending any state money because they provided such a big bargain sale to our work. We have a program called the Farm and Forest Viability Program. Part of our mission is capacity building. And about 20 years ago, after hearing about a similar program in Massachusetts, the end of the Dean administration and the governor asked us to try to stand it up in Vermont. It provides business planning and technical assistance to farmers across the state, whether they're operating on conserved land or not. And the chart there shows you what it is they felt they gained in a variety of business skills. It's one-on-one partnering a consultant, either through a nonprofit or a private business consultant, with an individual business. And the folks that you see pictured here operate on 25 acres in Norwich, and they had some challenges that really made pivoting in the COVID environment, pivoting their business and increasing its size really important. Within farm viability, Senator Starr asked us to help rural communities about 5 years ago get more access to resources. And the program under the statute is focused on communities of 5,000 or less. Two different examples. One is in Ferrisburg, where a slaughterhouse facility owned by Carl Cushing was successful in getting $1 million grant with our support to triple the size of their facility. And then over in Pittsburgh, we helped win a planning grant that's providing a child care center for that community that I'm told will have both provide 26 families the opportunity to have a place for their kids to go and add payroll in that community.
Yep. Yes, sir.
Gus, can I just try to understand your role with the slaughterhouse and also the farm? I don't see VHCB.
What we do with this program is we provide grant writing assistance so people can compete for various grants
Okay,
in small communities where there isn't professional staff.
yeah,
Or where the application process is really difficult. So I'll talk about this more a little later, but, we've helped.
okay, no, that's helpful. You're not providing funds,
We're providing grant writing support.
right, and that's important.
It's very similar, I think, to the goals that the governor asked you to approve in the
Right,
Budget Adjustment Act, and it's something we've been on for a number of years, focused on a few core areas related to our mission, like outdoor recreation, agriculture, food, that kind of thing. So we're helping people access both federal funds, but also state funds for communities that just don't have the ability to compete for them on their own.
good, thank you.
So I'm going to ask a question that, wasn't there the grant writing position sitting in ag budget or something?
At one time, there was.
Okay.
Yes,
All right.
but it's now part of our budget, yes. We've always carried out the work, and we've gone from this being a part of somebody's job to a full-time job, and doubled the size of the program this last year, as we have with the Farm and Forest Viability Program. We don't have one housing program. There's about 8 or 9 housing programs listed here. But what we're interested in, I guess, again, is transformational impact. And I think transformation happens in 2 ways with the work that we do and that we hope to do. Both of these buildings, or both of these sites in 2 different communities, St. Johnsbury and Waltham, were blighted. The building in St. Johnsbury was owned by a guy from Massachusetts. He didn't care a bit about the community. There was about 10,000, this is the key corner in that community, about 10,000 square feet of vacant commercial space for most of the last 25 years. A rabbit warren of terrible apartments. There was a similar building in Windsor that we bought him out of back in 2008. But this was a cash cow for him.
It is a beautiful building.
But the story of this building is also one really of democracy triumphing, because if you went back a decade, St. Johnsbury had a select board that was just at war with itself. And there came an election and they voted out 4 members of the select board, contested elections. And they then called the Council on Rural Development in for a community visit. And the result of the community visit was, we can't have this community improved without turning around this central building in the center of our community. So a consensus was really built that this had to change. And so eventually a deal was made to buy him out. There's a condominium structure that was put in place between housing providers and the local economic development group. And commercial space is now all fully leased. About a year after this was completed, we were at a community visit that the council was conducting in Barry, and somebody in the evening session said, "We just want what St. Johnsbury has." Now, I'm not going to tell you St. Johnsbury doesn't have challenges today, but it is way ahead of where it was, and this was a big key to their turning things around. The upper picture, the chair knows well, because I think you can see it from your house.
Yes.
Waltham, Vermont.
I can.
And it was a derelict mobile home park that was abandoned, and in terrible shape, nobody living there. And what's there now are 14 net zero modular homes built at a factory over in Hartford that really changed the nature of that neighborhood. So this is a small community that we have served well, where there's really transformation of a significant way for a community of that size.
I love knocking on doors in the neighborhood to check. They're just,
I'm glad to hear that it's been several years and you still like knocking on the doors.
yeah, always. Well, anyway, there's also an article that was done in the New York Times of this, because this was so innovative at the time. Because this particular community, when you say net zero, at the time, those homes are, I think their heating and cooling was like $88 a year. But they're also the solar, they feed the grid, but if power goes out, this community converts to itself. It's self-contained.
Got backup batteries
Yes.
there.
Very
For a
cool.
while, yeah.
I mean, it's less cool today, but it was very cool then. It's still cool.
Yeah, I have a question about the St. Johnsbury housing facility.
Please.
There's lots of communities around Vermont where you have an older structure that's, falling down, and the owner is using it as perhaps a tax write-off.
It was a cash cow, yes. For him, it was not only did he have tax write-off, he had a federal rental assistance contract.
So how does your organization help acquire those buildings so that they can be transformed into what St. Johnsbury has?
Basically, it took a lot of hard negotiation. We are a quasi-public, but we do not have the power of condemnation. That's the one governmental power we do not possess. So it took some hard negotiation over a long period of time before a deal finally got made with him. And some might criticize some of the terms of the deal, but I think this community could not move forward without getting him out of ownership. And they were committed to doing it, and we helped.
Representative Dickinson?
Yeah, thank you. It looks amazing. How do you manage to go and make money on that? What is the business expense, and do you own it, or does somebody else own it, or how does that? Property taxes? How does that work?
It does pay property taxes. The housing in general that we invest in pays property taxes unless some local group had already gone to the community to get a tax exemption. So we need people to be good citizens. We are not the developers. We work through usually nonprofits or municipalities or partnerships that utilize something called the low-income housing tax credit to make these deals happen.
So that's the business plan, is you work with other people and you take advantage of tax credits, and then, so who collects the rent and how do they maintain it?
There's a partnership that owns the property that include a general partner that's usually a local nonprofit and often in conjunction with a statewide nonprofit called Evernorth that syndicates the tax credits and sells them to investors. And then there are limited partners who are the investors themselves.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. To talk about energy and climate for a moment, and this will be familiar for those who know Brattleboro, but this Melrose Terrace is a public housing project built in the 1960s, not in the flood, actually in the floodway. And over a 10-year period, ending with Tropical Storm Irene, it had flooded 4 times in 10 years. What ultimately happened was 2 buildings were built over near the high school on much higher ground, better ground. And this land has been decommissioned and being returned to the river. A different project that we did also along the Whetstone was where Sosamo Lumber has its holdings, and 5 acres were basically lowered to add flood resilience so there'd be less flooding downtown. So this is a great example of how the work of housing and conservation really needs to work together in a community. Again, we don't do this work. We work primarily through nonprofits, not exclusively, but primarily and with state funds. This is the list of them and the map of our regular partners around the state. And what I would say to you is that if you were in any other rural state, this would be unusual. There would be huge gaps if you were in Montana as to where a nonprofit network could reach. But we are reaching communities large and small all over the state to help with housing problems everywhere. A key part of our mission is permanent affordability. It's written into our statute, and we view this as the fiscally conservative approach, that you don't want to buy an asset over and over again. Some of you saw a year or so ago that the Bove brothers wanted to sell and displace 24 folks in Winooski, a market really stressed, lots of new Americans in their development. They ultimately backed down. 30 years ago, we helped conserve the largest rental complex in the state, Northgate Apartments. Back then, it was a $2.9 million investment by the state for 336 homes and a $22 million deal. Sometime it'll need renovation, but were we need to replace it at today's construction prices, if you could find a spot where you could site 336 homes and get them permitted, we'd be looking at $130 million. So the idea of permanent affordability is that we really want to recycle the public investment from one generation to next and not have to keep buying the asset over and over again on behalf of the public.
Yep. Yes.
I appreciate your point there in terms of, what we would cost today versus maybe what it cost in the past. But it begs the question, when we talk about affordability, what's the average cost of these units that we're taking old buildings and retrofitting? Maybe you're going to get into that. I ask because one of your partners is the Housing Trust of Rutland. And they just announced plans, which I'm happy to hear, of 3 buildings, 2 of which they own, 1 they have an option of converting it. But if you look at the total cost, and I know it's not all your money, some of it's yours, some of it's other sources, $500,000 an apartment. And they already own the buildings.
So
it just boggles my mind. That's not affordable. I don't think.
it's not affordable. And the prices that we see today are scary across the landscape. When we did that building in St. Johnsbury, it cost about $328,000 per apartment. If we put it out to bid today, it would be at least another $110,000 a unit higher. We have a really troubled construction market. When I first began to do this work as a young person, there was a differential even within Vermont. You could get a better deal in the Northeast Kingdom. We now have regional construction markets, and we're not seeing the benefits of pricing anywhere. It all costs too much. It scares me. It keeps me up at night, but it is the reality. My daughter wanted to build a house on our land, so the land was free to her. 1,500 square foot cape, that would be highly energy efficient.
Yeah.
Huntington Homes, a reputable manufacturer, was going to build the home for her, but it was going to take more than a year before they'd be ready. So as the year came to an end, she said she put a deposit in, but with no guarantee of what the pricing would be a year later in this market. So without the cost of land, without the cost of the septic system, without the cost of the road or bringing the power in, they told her when it was time to build $438.
That's after all of that. After all those other costs.
Without any of those other costs. They're a reputable builder, but we are not seeing in Vermont today a price differential that is significant that helps us build housing. It scares me, it keeps me up at night, but it is where the builders are telling us with competitive bidding the marketplace is today.
I didn't mean to.
No,
It boggles my mind, and
I agree with you. It boggles mine. It keeps me up at night.
especially when we're talking about apartments, there should be some efficiencies with putting units together in a building.
There are some efficiencies that absolutely happen, and then there are costs, and one of the costs is the cost, because we use a tax credit, is the cost of syndication. That's not, if you were building a house, you wouldn't be dealing with the costs of syndication that adds a whole layer of complexity, but also brings in private capital that is not taxpayers' dollars, or at least not taxpayers' dollars.
Thank you.
I wish we had a saner system for financing housing, but this is the national system we've been given, and the tax credits that we utilize from the feds add to our costs. So why do we have a problem in housing, and these two charts, the first one's from the Housing Finance Agency, and it just shows you what levels of housing have been getting built across the last 40 years or so. And while there was an increase around 2005 before the Great Recession, it then went way down, and it has not come back up in any significant way. And then the question of who is most burdened in Vermont, and this comes from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and it's just showing you that the less income you have, the greater your cost burden. The blue line tells you for people who are paying more than 30% of their income for rent. The red line, people paying more than 50% of their income for their housing costs. So when you get below 80% of the area median income, which I'll show you in a few minutes what it is statewide, it is a real challenge. That doesn't mean other people aren't being challenged by our housing market. But the less money you have, the less choice you have, and the more of your income you're going to use. What are we doing around the state? Lots of different kinds of rental housing everywhere. Downtown Brattleboro suffered a great fire early in the 2000s at the building you see on the left. It was only 8 apartments, and the fire chief wanted to demolish it. And the historic preservationists asked the local housing provider whether it could be saved. It was only 8 apartments. And they did that, and I think the building is functioning well. But what was more important, I think, is a few years later, a building called the Brooks House burned. And I think that because this building was saved, it gave the folks, the investors, and this was a private deal, not one we were involved in, the courage to say, yeah, we can figure this out and save the Brooks House, which is a really prominent building in Brattleboro. Down below, one of the things we've done the most of since the pandemic has been to convert. We in California lead the country in converting hotels to housing, but that's not a brand new thing for us. The senior center in Waitsfield came to us because they were tired of making meals in the fire station 25 years ago, and they said, there's an inn across the street. Could we make it housing? And we tried it as shared housing. That didn't work so well, and then converted it to apartments, and it's functioned, I think, really well since that time. We're working in our fast-growing communities like Colchester, and this is a deal that SD Ireland is building several hundred units of housing, but we're helping get one building that will be really affordable built, and it goes on that way. We are involved in home ownership. We've subsidized about 1,250 homes as permanently affordable home ownership, and that means people share their appreciation with future buyers. It gets people into home ownership at a really low price. That wouldn't be the case. About a little under 10% of the homes have been built by Habitat for Humanity chapters across the state. The building in East Montpelier is another net zero building. But to talk about the power of permanent affordability and sharing appreciation, this home in Brookline, when we first invested in it, it was $12,000 in a home that cost about $70,000 altogether. 4 different families have enjoyed home ownership there. The first 2 moved on to the conventional market after being there for a number of years. The third family had other difficulties and was there for about a decade. It's actually a local realtor who bought it. And a fourth family moved in 2 or 3 years ago. Norwich is a community that's not affordable by any means.
Great.
We did a 14-unit project there years ago. About 2 years ago, one of the homes came up for sale. In a community where you can't buy anything for under $500,000, that home had a market value for $250,000, but it sold for $140,000. So we're getting people into home ownership by sharing appreciation across decades that would otherwise not be possible. A lot of discussion about rural communities. I will be the first to say that there's nobody on this committee who couldn't say to me, you have not yet done enough in my community. But we do care about our communities, large and small, This map shows you how we've made home ownership investments and investments through the Vermont Center for Independent Living across the state of various sizes in towns large and small. So we do care about rural communities, and I'll just add a few other slides for you to see. That Groton Village has no public infrastructure, but we did a bunch of apartments there. We saved the post office in an 8-unit building in Wells River. I've had a long relationship with a former member of this committee, Representative Helm, who some of you know quite well. Early in my career, and his here, I walked into the committee one year and he was wearing a Housing and Conservation Coalition sticker. And I said to him, Representative Helm, I did not know we were so close to your heart. He said, closer to my heart than you are to my wallet.
Classic Bob, there you go.
The building on the top here is a marble piece of art on the green in Fairhaven, and there's a carriage house behind it, 13 apartments for the elderly. It was falling into the ground. The foundation was just rotting away and was saved by the Housing Trust of Rutland County. And I think from the moment that we took that on, and then some years later when we took on an old Section 8 in Fairhaven that I'm pretty sure Representative Shaw was the electrician on as a young man, and restored it. Representative Helm came to be a real supporter of our work. And I really appreciated the long relationship we've had with him. Here's more efforts in rural communities around the state, 7 units in Cabot, 7 in Reigate, 50 units in Townsend. And the reason for that, it's a development for the elderly. Some of it is independent apartments. Some of it is assisted living, is because of the presence of Grace Cottage Hospital. We're under construction with 20 apartments in Bristol. We're working with Habitat, or we did work with Habitat on a home in Pownell with the land donated by the Nature Conservancy. They conserved the larger part of the property, but this was against the road, and they've done that on a couple or 3 occasions. If you ask about the value of this coalition between housing and conservation interests, that's one of them. And of course, been up on the Canadian border in Richford and in Franklin. I don't know if any of you were around, probably not for Representative Hugh Gates' time, but he owned the Franklin Telephone Company and he won a lottery. And he said, he walked into my office one day when we were quite young, and he said, I want to do something for the seniors of Franklin. I want to use my lottery winnings to build housing for the elders in Franklin, and we did that. This I showed you, this chart when I spoke in December at Joint Fiscals Orientation, but this year alone, 1,000 homes either starting or finishing somewhere in the state of Vermont. To speak to who we target and who we need to think about helping, and I think there's no part of the housing market that isn't stressed at this point. I talked about my daughter's experience wanting to build, and she ended up buying an existing home for less than the $438 that Huntington would have built a home for her. There are all kinds of occupations that at even 80% of area median income will qualify. And we go up to 100% for rentals and 120% of median for home ownership. But whether you're a child care worker, a nursing assistant, a light truck driver, a teaching assistant, there is a great need for assistance to folks across the state. And in fact, when you're getting up into the $70,000 range, you're talking about teachers and cops and firefighters and state employees, at least at the earlier parts of their careers. Many folks are making less than that. The picture you see here, and we're seeing this more often, is a building that just opened in Winooski, 20 new condominiums built by the Champlain Housing Trust. The municipality donated the land for this. It's right adjacent to downtown. There's a health center and other services at the O'Brien Center, which is the site that it's on. COVID-19 and the housing crisis, we have done a lot of what we call special needs housing. The organization that serves survivors of domestic violence had just 7 units available to them. The Champlain Housing Trust has given them a new facility that will house 21 survivors. You're all aware of the opioid crisis. We just opened this facility in Barry for women and children in recovery. We're in the midst of getting 2 projects underway in Bennington and 32 units in Colchester. So working all over the state on that issue. And the Groundworks Collaborative opened a new facility and day station along with 20 winter beds in Brattleboro. So that's some of the special needs work that we're doing. Status of the appropriations. You have placed a great amount of trust in us, a great amount of support. I really appreciate it. We really appreciate it, and the communities you serve do. Of the $271 million.
Representative,
Just a quick question. On the hotel conversions, are you approaching communities about converting the hotels, or are they approaching you?
Well, again, we're working through intermediaries. So the Twin Pines Housing Trust just did a deal with a hotel in White River Junction. The Champlain Housing Trust has done the most of these hotel conversions. It's easiest to do when facility was already set up as suites so that there was a kitchen facility. But there's an old, I'm sure Representative can tell you that there was a roadside motel in West Brattleboro that's been converted into housing. It's had a lot of issues there, but that's taken place all over the state by a variety of groups. There's something in the housing literature called moving to opportunity. So we worked with a private developer who owned this property on Route 100 in Stowe that he's just opened and flipped to the Lamoille Housing Partnership. It's providing 16 homes. We have added on vacant lots in mobile home parks in Bristol and Bradford and Braintree, new manufactured housing units. The old garage in Bellows Falls, which was a blight in its community, is being converted to 27 new apartments. We're in downtown St. Albans across from City Hall, and we've just agreed to fund another 72 units near the downtown in St. Albans. There's about $42 million left to allocate. We expect it all to be fully allocated at our May and June board meetings, along with some of the funding and the budget adjustment.
While you're on this page, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about the farm worker housing and how that's going. Again, sort of along the questions that Rep. Holcomb asked, how do you find it? How does, so much of it is so awful. And, I'm sure people who are there, where do they go while it's being fixed? And goodness knows they need a better place than they are. And then they're worried about the whole status and all of that. So
I'm going to get to that in a couple slides.
Oh, you are?
Oh, look at
It
that.
said it on this page, so I thought I could ask, but I will wait.
Yeah, no, it's among the things we're doing, so I will.
Okay, thank you.
So this just is to give you a sense of what's happened over the years since the pandemic began. And when you add all those numbers up, we're providing some kind of housing for about 3,500 households around the state. I want to note of the 1,700 new rental homes that we've approved to create, about a third of them are going to people who have experienced homelessness. In addition, we've worked on 475 shelter beds, about 180 are new. The balance really needed safety improvements in a COVID environment to be healthy places for people to be. In addition to that, we've challenged our nonprofit partners to do more. And so of the 2,000 or so turnovers over the last 2 years, about 1 in 3 went to a family that had been experiencing homelessness. So this network of nonprofits that serves the entire state has really stepped forward in a big way. That has not solved your GA problem at all, but the fact that AHS DCF is reporting that they've rehoused permanently 3,000 households is in part due to the new construction and in part the willingness of the housing providers to tackle the issue of housing people who, in some cases, have some pretty important needs that need to be met while the social service sector itself is struggling. I do want to note at the bottom, 192 new homeowners, along with 427 folks who are homeowners in mobile home parks. And again, the power of recycling the public subsidy from one generation to the next. 103 of those new homeowners were buying homes over this period that were already in the portfolio that had been subsidized in previous years and didn't need a further infusion of public funds. Okay. So again, we're trying to take a fiscally conservative approach that recycles the dollars that you ask us to invest. Farm worker housing. We asked a fellow named John Ryan to do a needs assessment a few years ago. He delivered a report that said focus first on repair. And we have worked with the Champlain Housing Trust, who is in partnership with Extension to work with folks to do repair. The first 21 homes are under construction or in the process of getting under construction that will house 100 farm workers. We've allocated more money. They're about to accept a new round of applications, and we'd love to more than double this effort in the coming years if one-time funding is available. It's a serious problem, and it's a problem that many farmers just don't have the financial capacity at this point to address adequately themselves. Diversity, equity, inclusion. Obviously a major issue for all of us. And in light of murders that we saw a few years ago, we at a board retreat had a session on this, and Representative Colston, former Representative Colston, came to the session. He was very familiar with our work. He's a past trustee at the Champlain Housing Trust. And what he said to us was, do the work. And I think he meant a couple things by that. But he said, examine your own practices, figure out what you're doing well, what you're not doing well, educate yourselves about what the needs are, expand your outreach to communities. And we've had two different processes for both our housing and conservation partners to think more deeply about how do we overcome the barriers there are. And you can see the Catamount Trail Association has focused in part on getting children of color out skiing. We are trying to open as many doors as possible. The other thing that you asked us to do a year ago in the budget bill was to stand up a new land access and opportunity board. That group will report to you separately. Representative Bloomley was on the authorizing committee, I think, for that piece of legislation. But the group's met every 2 weeks since late July. They're very passionate about the need for more access to housing. They will be asking you for a little over $1 million to begin to expand their programming, expand outreach to communities of color, and it's work that we take very seriously. I'm going to switch to conservation for a few minutes. This is a project we did quite a while ago, Colchester Pond with the Winooski Valley Park District. Most of our work is done in conservation through statewide nonprofits like the Vermont chapter of the Nature Conservancy, like the Green Mountain Club, like the Vermont Land Trust, but there are really important regional and local organizations that we work with, some all volunteer. But this is a terrific project in Colchester that we did some time ago, and what we saw through the pandemic is how much more outdoor resources were getting used across the state as a matter of health. A different project we did some time ago in Colchester was Rossetti Beach. Colchester is the community, I think, with the most lakefront in Vermont and the least public access to the lake. Three projects worthy of note. The newest state park in the state is Alberg Sand Dunes State Park. It was inaugurated at the end of the Howard Dean administration. There was an opportunity that fell through to buy another 160 acres adjacent to the beach. That fell through in the early 2000s. That opportunity came around again and we closed on it this year. So it's just a fabulous resource. We've been working with a volunteer group, two volunteer groups, the Putney Mountain Association and the Windmill Hill Pinnacle Association, over 25 years in Southern Vermont. And when I went to their 15th anniversary quite a while ago, and I opened the first grant application and said, well, our vision is for a 10-mile hiking trail and to conserve 1,000 acres of land. They're now up to 25-mile hiking trail across 5 towns, and Lily Pond is the newest acquisition and over 2,000 acres conserved. The last project is in Newport, and the Vermont Land Trust bought a farm from the Scott family a few years ago. And they weren't sure what they were going to do with it. I think they thought ultimately it would be what they call a farmland access project. But the more that they looked at the property and talked to the community, they realized North Country Union High School was nearby. It's become a place where the students do a lot of work. And what happened is that with a special allocation of the capital bill of $200,000 and then a grant from that rural economic development program I mentioned, they went out and fundraised over $1 million to build this bike bridge, pedestrian bridge that connects the farm to Prouty Beach and downtown Newport. There are trails across the farm, and at the far end of the farm is the BB Rail Trail that goes to the Canadian border. So I'm not a native of Newport, obviously, but Newport has struggled greatly since the EB5 scandal. But I think that people in Newport have rallied around this project and hope that this bike path is going to be one of the drivers that helps the community move forward. And what I've seen in doing rural community development is that once something positive happens, it's much easier to get the next positive thing to happen in a community. So I hope that building this bridge will be a part of that agenda.
I would just say it's a beautiful property, the Scott Farm. It's right on the lake. There's wildlife and this bridge connecting it to downtown, to Prouty Beach, to downtown, to the rail trail system going up to the border. It is really lovely. If you haven't been there, I would invite everybody to come to Newport.
I've been
Well,
by
let's over
there.
at Woody's.
Yes.
Where is Newport?
I was up there a couple summers ago, and there's actually a picture on my phone, but it was a day that it was like 98 in the shade, and I was walking with Representative Marcotte and Senator Starr, and we didn't have to walk soak through. It was so hot, but it's what a beautiful place and what an asset that lake is. And I didn't mention it earlier, but we are also, at A&R's request, become the clean water service provider for Lake Memphremagog, and that work is also well underway. I'm not going to claim credit for Camel's Hump State Park, but I will claim credit on behalf of the board with the Duxbury Land Trust, another volunteer organization who recently conserved 58 acres that are being added to the park. And again, a great resource for the state and a great way we work with local folks doing great things. The heart of our conservation work has been farmland conservation. It's been the place where we've spent the most money and I think had a huge impact. We're at about 20% of Vermont's farmland conserved. We're having a big impact on water quality practices, a bigger impact on transferring farms from one generation to the next. The Brigham family, we did a deal with them some time ago, and we just helped them acquire an additional 58 acres in St. Albans. 41 of them are prime acres, and they have one of their offspring interested in taking over and beginning to look at eggs and vegetables and other ways other than they were conventional dairy. They then were raising heifers. They then went to organic dairy, and that's a struggle today too. So they're looking at new things to do there. Monument Farms is probably the largest processor of their own milk. I believe they've got about 400 cows. So we see that as economic generator. And the fellow who owns this other farm in Middlebury came to agriculture after being an ER doctor. I'm understanding.
So I have to tell you that he's my next door neighbor, so you should know where I live. And he has now conserved all the land around my property. So I figure the value of my house has gone up a lot. It's completely conserved. It's great.
Isolated there.
I have a great
It's
view
great.
to the
Yeah, you
west.
do.
It's
So when I began this work many years ago, we think that, 1 in 5 deals were about farmland transfers. Today, we'd say that it's more like 40 to 50% that purchase of development rights is helping to facilitate a transfer from one generation to the next. And there are an awful lot of young people, and I'm not going to talk about each of these, who are doing great things and are very enthusiastic about the opportunity with value-added products across the state. I'll just tell one story. Briefly, a young couple bought their first farm in Barry, the second farm expanded in Williamstown, and then opened the market that you see at the corner of 100B and Route 2. And I don't know if you've had a chance, Representative Dolan, to stop in that market, but the building was vacant for a long time, and I think it adds a lot. Lots of good local products. Community vitality also is defined, especially by our friends at the Preservation Trust of Vermont, as having a store community. The Albany store only got grant writing assistance from the READY program, but the winning that grant helped them get a second grant. It's the only commercial operation in the town of Albany, I'm told today. If you want to know how Representative Mahaly spends his spare time,
We've all been wondering. We can't figure it out.
$2.7 million for this store in East Calais that I'm told, or at least was claimed to be the longest operating general store in the state until it closed a couple of years ago. It's got 3 apartments in it. 2 of them will be affordable. So again, we do hit small towns and rural communities, including mine, including communities that don't have infrastructure, though it's always harder. I don't know if everybody knows that Vermont has a village named Algiers, but it has a store. It also has 17 units of affordable housing that we helped redevelop there. And the Putney store was under construction when it burned to the ground, and we helped get that rebuilt as well. So we consider those things to be really important in terms of community vitality, along with things like next stage arts and buildings for the arts or other community gatherings. The Farm and Forest Viability Program, we began about 20 years ago, as I said earlier. In addition to the skill building that I talked about earlier, it is increasing people's access to capital. It's increasing gross sales, and it's increasing net income. And we survey people who participate every year about this. It was really important through COVID in helping people like the Von Trapps in Waitsfield pivot their business model and help the group at Rebop Farm get more efficient. They also got a grant from us for a walk-in cooler. We have a very small grant-making program there. We do a lot of work through this program also to help address farmland access and farm transfers. The Baird family has been in agriculture for 100 years. Very early in my career, Bob Baird called me before he worked at the Vermont Land Trust and said, I want you to see my farm. And I got there and he gave me a pair of boots and we tromped around and got pretty wet. But he's been at it a long time, and he's working now on a transfer to his daughter and her partner of their sugar bush, and just a really good guy. And we do that regularly. The Rural Economic Development Initiative, we invested $500,000 in that program, and it has generated $10 million in grants all over the state. I think to 51 grants in 38 different communities, all under 5,000. So again, trying to pay attention to small rural communities.
They gave us, the ACB gave the store a READY grant, which allowed us to hire a development consultant, which in turn got us, a couple of $1 million in grants. So it was really heavily leveraged.
Yeah. And the picture there is of a farm in Panton where they got a significant value-added producer grant.
Yeah.
Before I talk about pipeline, I just want to make 2 notes. First, Triproc in Brattleboro is the largest co-op in the state of Vermont, over 300 homes. Probably more than 5% of Brattleboro's population lives there. 26 households live not in the floodplain, but in the floodway. And we helped get an earmark through Senator Sanders, I believe it was, maybe 2 years ago. And we hope this is the year we're going to help people move out of the floodway and also begin to help the park address its many infrastructure issues. There was a story in the New York Times The lodge, as you'll recall, burned at Ascutney Mountain and then the resort closed. Property values dropped by more than 25%. And the community came to us and said, we'd like to add the land around the lodge to our town forest. We want to take a page from Kingdom Trails and see if we can draw people back to our community to utilize the trails. They've since put in a rope tow. Property values are back up in Ascutney. And I think that the article in the Times was titled something like "A Town That Saved a Mountain and a Mountain That Saved a Town." And then last, we will close, I think, in the next month on the Clemens Family Farm in Charlotte. They were featured on public radio a week or so ago, one of 19 African-American owned farms, and it has become a cultural site in the state along with the agricultural activity. There is a huge pipeline for our work, which means there's a huge opportunity. When I spoke with Senator Kitchell before the session, she said, "You've always been a great place to park one-time funding. That won't occur," and I think she's right about that. I don't know how much you're going to have available, but we would be happy to continue to partner with you. And there's a tremendous opportunity, and I won't talk about the work that's being done in the Environment and Energy Committee, but they are passing out a bill that asks Vermont to meet some very high goals in terms of climate mitigation and biodiversity, and to better utilize, to maximize all the federal funding that's going to be coming at us for conservation. And we would love to be able to do that work. So there is a huge pipeline of opportunity ahead of us. There's something called the 4% housing tax credit. And I'm sure Maura would tell you that unlike the 9% credit, which it is virtually unlimited. So it only pays for about 1/3 of the cost of a housing development, but we do like to tap federal resources wherever we can. To get to the budget, this is our sources and uses budget. It's the kind of the best overview of our finances. And I'm going to say a couple things about it. The first is that property transfer tax, which was raised in 1988 to support our programs, is used not just for our administrative costs and housing and conservation, but also to bring various federal grants into the state. We will soon need to subsidize a new $4 million grant to mitigate lead paint. The feds will not give us enough to cover the costs of that program. We get none of the transaction costs for the farmland protection program. We do get matched dollar for dollar on easements. So the transfer tax helps us bring a lot of dollars into the state. It also makes a huge contribution to the budget of the Farm and Forest Viability Program and the Rural Economic Development Initiative. The second thing I will say to you is that when you look at the column of one-time funding, there's $10 million in that column. Last year, the budget you approved had that coming out of transfer tax. We are happy to take one-time funding. The administration proposes it be used exclusively for housing. If you choose to support that recommendation, we will likely do a whole lot. We'll have to cut back programs like Farm and Forest Viability and READY, as well as the kind of conservation work that we're doing across the state for things like projects like Alberg or Lily Pond. We just will not have the balance between our goals if you choose to earmark in that way. So that is a problem.
Let me see if I understand you. So if we do this, in order to do that, you're going to have to, because it'll be so much more work on your plate, you might have to balance it against not doing other things?
Well, the administration's proposal is that $10 million be used only for housing. And last year that was in the housing and conservation column. And so
housing and conservation.
Right.
We'd like to give you the ability to, because between the emergency shelters and other things and the flexibility to meet
Board
where.
would certainly, we'll do as much good in as many ways as we can based on what you give us. And we'll do less good if you give us less and more good if you can be more generous. And you and the administration have to wrestle that out. But certainly the board would rather have more flexibility and would like to cut back our conservation work, our rural economic development work through READY and through the Farm and Forest Viability Program. But obviously, there's also a lot less proposed in one-time funding for housing than there's been the last 2 years.
11 million.
Also be cut back dramatically.
I'm sorry, I was.
I was trying to figure out, the property transfer tax is just those.
11.
In the trust fund, the 8.2 and the 3.8?
Last year, it was a little over 20 million. This year, the administration has moved 10 million from the trust fund to one time.
Oh, I thought it was the usual plus 10 million, so thank you.
Yeah, no, we're not there. This slide just tells you what the history of the transfer tax has been and what our funding has been. And the green line is transfer tax allocations. The blue line adds in the capital bill. The red line is what the statute would give us. And so what you will see is from about 2014 forward, we were pretty close when you added those two together to what the revenue was supposed to be under the statute. And from 2020 on, as the transfer tax has risen dramatically, we've fallen further behind those numbers. Now, we're not showing you one-time funding that's been made available for housing, but this year, compared with where we ought to be, we'll be short quite a bit. And so, again, we would love it if you felt that there was more value in continuing the momentum with all of the activity and possibilities that are in front of us.
So you have a lot on your plate, really, and across the state. We rely so much on you to do so much good across the state. You know, of course, the sentiment of the House and the Senate and the administration is to, respond to the housing situation statewide. We don't want to burn you out and not being able to do it. We'd love to be able to work with you to figure out what is doable. We have an opportunity with a great deal of one-time money, a lot more than the ongoing money.
Well, what I can say to you about one-time funding is that over the last couple of years, you've asked us whether we could get something north of $100 million out the door. And you had left this committee, Madam Chair, but when you first asked us about $33 million to be spent in 9 months, I don't think anybody thought it was possible to get that done, and we did that. I think we returned a couple $100. And we will fully commit all the funding that's been made available, and I believe that there is plenty of appetite to do more. And, you asked me, and I will always shoot straight with you when we run the budget adjustment. I said, we're not going to spend what's in the BAA this year, but you'll send the right signal. I have no doubt that there's the demand to build and rehabilitate and do home access projects and home ownership units for another 1,000 units next year if the funding was available. So we'll do as much good as you can.
Yeah. Is it helpful to say this much this year and be able to carry forward into the next year, or, trying to structure the best way to invest?
Well, I'm happy to think with you about the best way to do that. We understand that we're not going to have the large surpluses
Going into
generated forever. Having said that, I'm going to say as a policy matter, and given the work that VHFA has done on the needs assessment, needs for housing, which is at least another 30,000 homes over the next 8 or 10 years, not all of which would be affordable, but that's, given the growth patterns in Vermont, that's what we need. I think that the policy committees need to rethink, and the investments that you want to make in climate mitigation through conservation. Policy committees need to rethink, how do we raise revenue for both of these important needs? Because full funding, as you've heard from advocates, would be a wonderful thing, but it will be, our housing activity will be so diminished compared to the last 3 years that we'll hardly recognize ourselves. And the costs, when we started the housing revenue bond with Governor Scott, we were building stuff between $220 and $240 a unit, and we're at regularly seeing projects above, at 400 and above today. So the cost differentials have completely changed, and we need to look at that from a policy perspective.
Representative Mahali, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Mahali and the
I
representative.
just want to understand this graph, and I'm not sure I do. So am I right that the blue line is the total amount that PTT generates?
That's the total amount that PTG generates. The red line is what, if you looked at the statute, that's what our share would be.
So that's like 27 million or something like that.
Over 27 million.
Yeah, I think 27.8.
27.8 million, okay. So then the purple line is what's appropriated by state funds that are not from property tax, right?
That blue to purple line represents the green line plus the capital bill funding.
The green line is the actual appropriation.
That's what's in your bill.
Right.
And the capital bill, when you add in the capital bill dollars, that gets you to the next line.
The next line. So the gap, if you will, which you were referring to, which was pretty small in 2020 or 2019, the gap you're referring to is the gap between
The red
purple
line.
line and the red line,
Yes.
which has gotten greater.
Yes.
Thank you.
Good. Representative Lindley and then Representative Dickinson.
Sure, thank you. You know, so I don't live your work, and I'm just wondering how does it, what is the time frame within which projects are developed, and what is it that that is needed in order, how many months are needed in order to kind of get a project that's an idea to being kind of shovel ready? Because I know that it's something that's come up in conversation, and like, why do we need to invest right now in projects that would happen in the future?
Well, if you're a developer, certainty matters. In other words, if you're going to take the risks of permitting costs, acquiring land, design costs, you need to think that there's an end in sight, okay? And the reason people aren't building affordable housing without the public's help is because it doesn't cash flow. If people could make money at this, they would go ahead and do that. But the rents that many Vermonters can pay, or the cost of home ownership that Vermonters can afford, is well below what it costs to build today. So if a developer is going to take the risk, for profit or nonprofit, they need to think they're going to get their money back out. Every project has a different road to go. We just approved in the last couple months a development in downtown St. Albans of 72 units. They want to close in April. They have all their permits in place, the designation programs are working well, the TIF district is working well, and it will probably close. We funded a project a little over a year ago in Putnam, and it looked ready to go. It was in a designated area. It had the municipality's support. And a local neighbor, pro se, appealed. About a week ago, a judge issued a summary judgment, which we weren't expecting necessarily, throwing the case out and saying, go ahead and build. So it is now ready to go, but we thought it would be under construction last summer. It has one more financing piece to pull together now that it's got its permits. I doubt, because the person was appealing pro se, that it'll get appealed to the Supreme Court, but if it does, it'll be delayed a year. So it's very hard to predict how, even when you have community support, the poster child for a delayed permitting process took place in Woodstock. We funded a project across from the middle and high school, community support, community votes by the school district to extend water line, all kinds of stuff. But there was a neighbor, and he had a lawyer who was very good, who worked for free for 10 years. They took 2.5 trips to the Supreme Court, and it took 10 years to get that project permitted. So there's all kinds of things that, we're always looking for community consensus where we can get it. And, the work that St. Albans has done around its TIF district and the creativity of that city manager is such that he really makes things happen. And there's enough consensus that that'll get built very quickly. In your city, people have been fighting, and I think this will be the year, over the downtown block. And a bunch of progressives actually appealed because they thought a 14-story building in downtown Burlington was going to be too tall. And I think we're finally ready to see a 10-story building get built. And we didn't fund that years ago. We waited until we thought things had settled down. But you don't always know in the development process how quickly things are going to happen. But I'm confident that, as I said, 1,000 units in a year, either starting or completing, that's a lot of activity across the state. So I'm confident that a lot more can be done. Very few projects are getting held in appeals these days, I think in part because of the designation programs, and in part because more and more municipalities are recognizing that they need the housing. But we give neighbors lots of rights. Representative Bongartz has a bill that I think would be helpful on those issues, but we give neighbors in Vermont lots of rights to appeal.
Other questions?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I want to go back to the graph or the financial graph that's in your thing here at the end.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not really sure I understand what this all means. What's the difference between the green shaded area and the white area? And are these all, is this a breakdown of, this is not a P&L, this is a breakdown just of revenue? Is that what that is? And how is, I'm just not sure quite what the whole. Starting with sources. Are these sources of revenue?
Can I zoom in a little bit so
Yeah.
folks can see it?
Yep. Okay, so the top line is the property transfer tax, which is the funding that you are being asked to appropriate along with the capital bill. And it is showing you how those funds are spread across a number of programs. But those are the dollars you're being asked to appropriate. And the uses down below are telling you where the dollars are going. So from various programs, some dollars are going to board operations, some are going to direct project expenses, and then there are project grants and loans, which are the awards to the people that are applying to us for funding.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm following that. Says federal grants, loan repayments, those are your expenses then? Interest on fund, housing mitigation funds, those are the things that those are your expenses?
I'm sorry, you're,
The HCB sources and uses, it's page.
yeah,
Page number.
We're there.
The ones with all the pictures.
Yeah, so I think I can see your question
Is
here.
it the same one that's on the screen, Lynn, that you're looking at?
No.
It's not.
No, it's not.
Yes,
Oh.
yes. I think that's it, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so these categories you're seeing across the top in the gray, those are sources of funds coming into VHCB that we're putting out the door to community partners.
Yeah.
So the ones in green, those are state appropriated funds. And then in white, those are both federal grants and also other sources that are in statute coming to us, I believe. And our finance director, Anne, is also on, and she can clarify if I missed anything. Below the double, at the bottom of the chart here where you see uses, that's the money either being used internally to administer these programs or more often going out the door to communities.
So unlike almost any other organization or group that we hear from, they have so many different sources of funds. It comes from all over the place.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it look a little more confusing than our typical crosswalk, where we might have general fund, federal funds, special fund, interdepartmental transfers. This isn't like that.
Yeah, I got that.
So just to give you a couple examples, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is the second column, has a program that provides matching funds for farmland protection, okay? And we get about $3 million a year from that program, and we invest transfer tax dollars to make that program work as well, okay? AmeriCorps, we receive $495,000 grant from the feds. We spend $566,000 from the trust fund to support that grant.
Gus, this is Ann Duffy. Can you hear me?
Yes, you sound great, Ann.
Oh, good. Thanks. Can I just add something to this? I think the representative had a question about, on the far left column, there was some questions around loan repayments, federal grants. And that's in the sources column. Those represent other revenues that VHCB expects to receive, such as interest income and that sort of thing. So that's another piece of this. I don't know if that helps or not.
Yeah, it helps, but it's not a P&L. I mean, it looks like the bottom line and the far right line, they all add up to the 96.119 million. So it's not really a P&L, it's really a source of income, and then you allocate where it comes from. I'm just looking to see if there's expenses in there. I don't see any expenses. It's not an expense.
The uses or the expenses.
The uses are the expenses. Everything gets sort of filtered. I mean, there's got to be some admin costs in there somewhere.
And that shows up under the uses section, which is the bottom full section of the chart, where it says board operations. That's where we've got our administrative costs are on that row.
Okay.
This fifth row from the bottom. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. There is a crosswalk, I think, in the other,
that you're more familiar with on page 9 of the other document, which really just has the state money, if I'm doing this right.
Yeah, I don't have it up on the screen, but I'm thinking if I can.
We all have this document. And if you go to page 9, it'll look more familiar to what the other agencies, et cetera, do. Although it's still more complicated than so Rep. Dolan has a question.
Are you finished?
I'm done, thank
Okay,
you.
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming today. I just wanted to take 1 second and comment on certainly the great work that you have done in my district. We've already showed examples of the housing needs, but just to put kind of a story around it, we have businesses that can't find employees. And we pride ourselves on having a working landscape with farm and forest viability. And we are finding ourselves struggling with keeping our local farms going, our local timber businesses going. And that type of work that you're investing in with respect to conservation provides an economic boost to a rural economy that I think is something that we all appreciate. We're trying to do the same thing on recreation, similar to what these investments you talked about, whether it's in the Scutney or in the Northeast Kingdom. We're trying to do the same, and fortunately have been trying to leverage state dollars to create that recreational hub. But I just attended last week a 3-town meeting between our 3 valley towns of Waitsfield, Warren, and Fayston. And we had a number of new people that we welcome in our town. They've are at least living at least for a part-time basis. And they described how when they moved to Vermont or wanted to move to Waitsfield, they're looking for the homes in the forest, the homes on the fields, the homes in our working lands. And if we don't have a plan for how to protect and support that working landscape type of part of our economy, then we are going to be losing such a major economic driver for our communities. We're multi-generational families that live here. And I just want to say that the partnerships that we've realized with you all, investing in using those conservation dollars and in in addition to that, that farm enforced viability of helping our working land stay working is just bar none, such a huge benefit for our region.
Well, and that's why I say both the READY program and the Farm and Forest Viability program, I view as capacity building, part of our mission, and helping entrepreneurs succeed on the land is really a part of our work now, and helping those enterprises. And so really critical. I just want to close with one other story about this last picture, which is 3,000 acres in the Northeast Kingdom. And the story about this is that Governor Kunin, our second year around, thought she had a deal to buy it. And at the last moment, the seller decided to do business with a couple from New Jersey. And Representative Harrison, I don't know if you remember this, but she wanted to go to court. Her staff eventually talked her out of that. 30 years later, with the help of the Nature Conservancy and the Vermont Land Trust, we bought a working forest easement on this land for less than it would have cost to buy back then. There's 5 miles of hiking trails. The land is not posted so people can hunt or hike. Half of Long Pond, all of Mud Pond are protected. There's a nice walk to the fishing access there. So to me, when we talk about working landscape, how we go about living on the land, where we land, where we build our housing, this picture speaks to, I think, why most of us choose to live here, whether you hike this land or hunt this land, or you just enjoy seeing a picture of it when I show up. So I'm going to stop there. That's the end of my presentation.
And that's a stunning picture.
Yeah.
And I know we're at the end, but I'll just make one closing comment. I appreciate the one full-page picture of my neighbor. But I feel slighted by the Northeast Kingdom because Newport, and then close with the Northeast Kingdom. I mean, really.
Next year it'll be the Jim Jeffords State Forest. Maybe not in your district, but closer to home.
Always got something wherever anywhere.
Just kidding.
Any other questions from anybody else? I always love hearing your presentations. Thank you.
Thank you
so much for all you do. And Tiff, are you
I am.
If we all have other questions or want to see more pictures, we'll go talk to Tiff and you'll be our liaison.
Okay, and just again, wherever you land budget-wise, if you have constituents that we can be of assistance to, please tell them to make our phone ring, send us an email, whatever it is, and we want to be there for them. And we'll do as much good as the budget can provide.
Well, we appreciate your support and collaboration.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Except give me my.
Committee, this is the last for the day, and
We're getting out early?
We're getting out early today. I hope you appreciate it. We're on at 8:30 tomorrow morning with the VOSHA Review Board. So we have a big day tomorrow. We have Commerce and Community Development, and we have Agency of Natural Resources. So we have other big